Welcome, Duke alumni, friends, to this session of the Duke Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program that's organized in a set of thematic courses. I'm Jo Supernaw, the Director of Academic Engagement with the Lifelong Learning team here at Duke Alumni. And I'm really excited for you to join our program today discussing our pocketbooks. This program is part of our theme called Discourse for Democracy, which is sponsored and inspired by POLIS, the Center for Politics with the Sanford School of Public Policy. And joining our discussion today are two faculty who are just incredible. We have Michael Munger from Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, Professor of Political Science, and Lisa Gennetian, who is the Pritzker Professor of Early Learning Policy Studies with the Sanford School of Public Policy. So welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Mike and Lisa.
Thank you.
You guys take it away.
All right. My job was to set this up a bit as the political scientist. One of the things that I study is elections. And a difficulty about talking about midterm elections is that they're weird. They're hard to predict. The turnout is low. Often people have relatively low information about issues because they haven't watched debates, and often it's retrospective. And what political scientists mean by retrospective is people aren't really looking at candidates. They're asking themselves a couple of questions. One of those generically is, do they approve of the current president? And President Biden is not doing very well. He has a 42% approval rate. And people ask themselves about the economy. And often if people are unhappy with the president's leadership and the economy, then the party of the incumbent president gets hammered. In this case, that's the Democrats. And the frustrating thing about that is it may not have much to do with candidates. But there's two unique factors. What happened over the summer in Afghanistan and now with Russia, which I think people is giving people a sense of disquiet and sort of lingering being upset about COVID lockdowns and uncertainty about vaccines. So I thought it was interesting to ask what issues people were finding to be particularly important. And I just said that people may not look at issues, but if you ask them questions, they try to sound like they're involved. And so they'll give some answer they think the interviewer wants to hear. But still, the economy comes out on top here, and 80% think that it's either the single most important or very important. The recent abortion decision and access to reproductive rights is important. Inflation, education in schools, climate change are all things that people list. It's not clear that those are going to matter for the election, though. Now, the two big national races that we have are control of the Senate and the House. And the Democrats are favored to win the Senate. And in fact, if anything, the Democrats might pick up seats. And you might ask, how can that be given what I just said? Well, only 34 seats have Senate races. Of those, 23 are safe, so only 11 are really contested. And it happens that 7 of those have Republican incumbents. So all they can do is hold those. So if you think of all 11 of those seats as toss-ups, if they're coin flips, it might be that the Democrats might even pick up some seats in the Senate. So all those seats the Democrats won in 2020, they won't come back up for re-election until 2026. The big story, I think, is the House of Representatives. The Republicans are almost certainly going to take the House of Representatives. And what's interesting about that is that those probabilities are actually turning back in the direction of the Republicans are even more likely than they were a week or two ago. The recent polls have been very dim for the Republicans. If you had to guess, it looks like if you do a lot of simulations, the mean number of seats in the House will be 226 for the Republicans. And it takes 219 to control the House, so they'll have at least a working margin. And the last one, I think, is the most interesting one. Of the people that are likely to vote, there will be a 3% majority in favor of Republicans. Often we think that the Republican success in the House is due to gerrymandering, and there is some of that. A lot of states have very gerrymandered districts. But in fact, more people are going to vote for Republicans in U.S. House races than are going to vote for Democrats. So that was the introduction that I wanted to give, and that's sort of a view from 10,000 feet. I thought we might call on Lisa to give us a few more details about the economy and the way that politics of the economy is influencing the way that families and people are thinking about this election. So, Lisa.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for that political science overview. So I'm going to talk a little bit, getting at the core of the theme of today's chat related to pocketbooks. And I'm going to kick off by saying, voters can be driven by self-interest and self-protection based on their own circumstances and experiences. And, I think the pattern that Mike just showed you is a very much a reflection about what individuals care about. I'd like to just step back and think and have this conversation pivot a little bit on broader social interest and social protection. And I'm going to speak to where I sit and kind of my expertise, which is thinking about children and the lives of children and families in the US. Right away, the starting point is that families are really stressed. And families with young children all the way up to, just under age 18, I might even argue up to age 25, 26, right? So like thinking about transitions to young adulthood. But this post-pandemic context has only elevated stress. And this stress is present across the income spectrum, but especially harsh for families with really low and unstable resources. So the elements of the economy that matter a lot to people more generally, like inflation and what's happening with childcare and in our public infrastructure, like schools, is happening in a more kind of salient way for families with really low income. And this notion of self-reliance and economic security, which is sort of a theme of the American economy and politics, I would argue, relies on sort of a really stable and accurately kind of rewarding labor force. And this has not always played out well for families who are increasingly facing some economic precarity with respect to the labor force. And this is just magnified, right, by the lack of other types of economic cushions, whether it's savings, access to low-cost credit, insurance to cover the cost of shocks, and little easy outlets for emergency assistance. So first off, just to, again, think about context here, the majority of children in households with low income, and in fact, the majority of children in the US are in households with at least one working adult. And earnings is the primary source of income, right, for most households with children. And this is interesting thinking about what's happening now. Labor market demand is really high, right? And so this gives some workers right now really good options to improve their wages or hours or even benefits, but not everyone can respond to labor market demand because workers don't have equal options. And in addition to that, one of the sticking points is childcare and schools. I suspect all callers on this phone who have children understand the dilemma, right? Our system was fractured, inconsistent before the pandemic, and now it's magnified. So the whole host of supports that we were holding on to allow for working, right, and for stable earnings is now pretty broken. And many of those people who are working in those systems, so our teachers and providers, are also, right, people serving food, people driving buses, people providing, vaccines and after-school care. Those folks are also parents. So high-income people can solve this problem. They've been doing that for a long time with private resources. People from low to middle income have to rely on our existing infrastructure and public services and public goods. So when childcare is not available, it's hard to go to work. Same with school. The second thing I want to point out, which I think will be important for this conversation, is when income doesn't keep a pace with inflation on basic needs like gas, and housing, and food, then the people being harmed the most are families with the lowest resources, right? So this is compounded by the other issues I just raised regarding infrastructure. So the more that folks have to rely on gas-propelled cars means reliance on gas to get to work, to get children to care. And so the infrastructure very much intersects with the issues of the costs of, basic needs like transportation. So food, transportation, rent, utilities, and cell phones, right, are the top 5 expenses for households with children residing at about $50,000 a year. So that's 200%, or about 200% above the federal poverty level, to give you some context. So a lot of this is subsidized, but not all of it. And rent is particularly a big expenditure item. And without things like eviction protection, for example, this can add a lot of housing precarity, right? So now we've got lost addresses, and we've got children who don't have a safe place to sleep. Third, this will also come up, I hope, as we continue to talk. When there are disruptions to goods and services, it affects low-income families harshly. You know, for me, one of the prime examples of this was the disruption to infant formula, which was not just pandemic related, but also uncovered something about how the contractual relationships between two particular formula companies and the largest, it's called the Women's Infant and Children Feeding Program, which offers formula and food to eligible families with children under the age of 3. So families were literally left without food for their babies. Okay, so much of our labor force that is charged with caring and teaching children is also struggling. It's families as well as the providers. You know, the US population is skewed on the older end of the spectrum. This is, I think, Mike, you can talk to about who, you know, the demographics of people who vote. And so our voters are not always aligned with thinking about kind of the broad population. And if we think about the US population aging, you know, where does that leave us if we're thinking about investments for the future? And the future is really about children in the US. And children rarely elevate to a voting issue at the federal level. So I think with that context, we can pivot to think about policy and think about kind of policy responses, and maybe some that have even taken like have elevated to the political platforms for various debates. Turning it back to you, Mike.
There's an important factor in economics, which I think is playing out along two dimensions. After the pandemic, a lot of people are moving back into work, but not always into jobs. And so that means two things. One, that they're working gigs, or maybe they're working as contractors. And that means that their hours may be less predictable, and they don't have the kinds of benefits that they had relied on before for medical care. So a lot of the return to the workforce of people that had laid out during COVID, now on moving back, the sense of precariousness on both those dimensions, where I'm not sure how many hours I'm going to work next week, and I'm not sure if I have benefits. It seems to me that that's not something that's even being mentioned politically. If I see ads, and this is typical, but I think it's more striking this time, if there's some statewide race in your state, you probably are seeing ads where people are just talking about how evil one of the candidates is. You're not hearing anything about what the candidate is going to do to try to solve these economic problems. And I'm afraid that kind of campaigning is just more effective. The other thing that I want to emphasize that Lisa had already said, but it matters, the people who vote tend to be white, old, and college educated. Now, there are exceptions, but changes in turnout almost always are increases in people that are not in that sort of core voting group. And since midterms always have much lower turnout, and this midterm might have historically low turnout, the result may be to kind of validate the kind of campaigning that we've seen, which has been mostly negative. So I think there's a disconnect, even more than usual, given the particular economic needs that we face. There's been even more of a disconnect than usual. The Democrats have been very reluctant. I've seen a number of, quite a bit of commentary on this lately. The Democrats have been very reluctant to talk about some of the things that I would say most experts would agree worked during the pandemic, where there were payments, where there was an attempt to help families and people on the edge make up some of the difference between rent, being able to drive their cars, maybe to have insurance. But the Republican response has been to say that all of that kind of spending increases inflation. And the result has been that the Democrats have not been able to use that issue which otherwise might have been to their advantage, and more substantively would have raised the issue of economic precarity. So I think that's kind of been just taken off the chessboard. And it means that I think the results of this election are not really going to be a referendum on policies that worked during the pandemic. It's going to be a referendum on the popularity of President Biden, and that might go very poorly for the Democrats. So the question is how to have made it more about the economy, and I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, thank you for that context. Let me pick up on a few additional points you raised. Really interesting using the language of referendum on, kind of what we learned through the pandemic. So this is sort of, it is a new launching pad in some ways, right? To think about where we should go in the future. I think it's really fascinating thinking about the debates around cash to people, which was very uncomfortable for many folks. Under the arguments of boosting demand in the economy, this kind of got through under the Biden administration. And I think you're right that it's been twisted, right, as one of the explanations for driving inflation. And that's been super unfortunate. I do want to stress, though, something like not so much stimulus payments, those are one-time, lump sum payments, but something like the expanded child tax credit, which was a 2021 offer only to families, that it had some features that allowed for the first time families to receive some kind of credit from the government, many working families even, that were only offered, right, to middle income families prior to the pandemic. And so the idea of refundability and making that no longer, right, a condition of a certain amount of earnings was a real nuance. I think people don't fully appreciate how this opened the door to people who could really benefit from this income that just simply were not eligible before because they didn't engage with the tax system in prior years or just didn't have enough earnings that made them eligible. But the other cool thing about it that I want to mention, and I will put a source here in the chat, over the period of the time of the pandemic, I had the opportunity to kind of work on this bipartisan effort with the Brookings Institution and the American Enterprise Institute, and they pulled together some academics. And it was really about thinking about a future agenda for children. And, one of the things we agreed on really early was it was going to be budget neutral propositions, which is really challenging to think about. There were a number of things that struck me about those conversations. And one of them was there was agreement on things like more income to low income families. And, that's traditionally not kind of folks with conservative ideologies. They usually don't land on that kind of recommendation. And so what struck me in those conversations is that, this recognition that the US doesn't really have a pro-family policy. And this was one opportunity to have a federally, right, initiated and legislated policy that says we support families. And what people do with this cash, with this money, is really up to them. And so for some people, that might mean I'm not going to go into the gig economy, right? And, suffer from or try to juggle the uncertainty about that. I'm going to take that money and spend time with my children. For other people, that might be I'm going to invest in some education and increase my certification, and maybe that'll be a bump above into a different kind of job. And for other people, it might mean, basic needs, moving to a better apartment, whatever. There are a diversity of ways that families could use this money. But the big picture point, I think, that struck me about the expanded child tax credit in particular, and how that's sort of now off the table, as far as I know, maybe it'll come back, is that there is bipartisan support for this across many circles. And so I think it's an interesting question to understand whether there'll be any voting traction around that. But Mike, you also raised the labor market, right? And this idea of like the gig economy. And you're right, I don't hear a lot of conversation about that. And I think from a family and child perspective, there's a temptation to talk about flexibility. And that's certainly true. Flexibility around, child being sick, being able to adjust your hours, adjusting hours with other caregivers in the home. There's a lot to be said about flexibility that doesn't actually exist in many jobs. But on the other hand, that comes with a lot of uncertainty. And so if income flow is not certain in the household, it takes a lot of time and energy to budget, right? In addition to kind of making sure you're bringing enough resources into the home. So should we talk about inflation a little more? Is that
one sure way to make people go to sleep in the afternoon is to talk about some of the details of inflation. But the difficulty with inflation is a number of people, particularly on the right, might be accused of having predicted 9 of the last 1 inflations, because we were going to get inflation in 2001, we were going to get it in 2008, we're going to get it in 2011, and there really was no inflation all of those times. The explanation that usually is given for inflation is a massive increase in the money supply, but that really has happened on many occasions. What seems to have happened here is an increase in the price of oil and a number of commodities because of supply chain interruptions around the pandemic. And the result was a substantial increase in a number of input prices that has raised the product of some, not all, of the things that we buy. And of course, that comes across as being measured inflation. I think there the Democrats made a mistake at the beginning. Instead of saying this is normal economics, the response of the Democrats was, and Elizabeth Warren in particular, her response was, well, this is corporate greed. As if corporate greed had somehow gone up in the early spring of 2022. Corporations have always been greedy. That's not really an explanation. And so the difficulty is that now it is more different. The oil prices have gone down and inflation has stayed up. And so the Democrats don't have an answer to the problem of inflation. The difficulty that I think we're going to have for a while is that the Federal Reserve is an independent central bank. And so long as they are primarily concerned with inflation, they're going to try to ratchet up interest rates to the point where growth of other kinds is cut back. And this is just a disaster. This is a textbook disaster for the party of the incumbent president, because so much of the research in political science would say people more or less don't pay attention to issues. They look at growth rates and they look at inflation rates. And if those are bad, they vote against the party of the incumbent president. There's nothing you can do about that. There often are contradictions of the conventional wisdom. One other thing to say is that the polls, if anything, generally have underrepresented Republican strength. So in 2016, the strength of the Republicans was not predicted. 2020, the amount of Republican vote was astonishing. They still lost, but there was far more than the polls had shown. So the polls may be underestimating the Republican strength as a result of these things. And I think when it comes down to it, inflation is more of a problem than probably makes sense rationally. It's just something that people are really upset about. And we blame the incumbents. And that is an over-attribution of control and power. The incumbent president has very little control over prices. But I think the Democrats are going to have a lot of trouble with the issue of inflation. There's one other thing that I think is operating in the background that is actually closer to my own research on antitrust, and that is social media, Twitter. Is Elon Musk going to buy it? Should there be regulation of Facebook, Twitter, TikTok? I think a lot of people feel we live in sort of a surveillance society that looks like panopticon, but it's not controlled by the government. It's controlled by corporations. And it is difficult for people to trust that the corporations have their best interests at heart. And so should the government be doing more to control the expansion of these corporate behemoths? And I think a lot of people mistrust the motives of the government to say that actually they're in this together. And so it's easy to spin out conspiracies And this ends up, one of the difficulty with conspiracies on both sides is it reduces the legitimacy of democratic governance. So if I say you're a liar and you say I'm a liar, voters believe both of us. And that ends up, we're on the verge of some grave difficulties about democratic legitimacy. And I worry that the problem is being made worse by our lack of trust in the big social media companies.
Yeah, I think those are exactly right. I would say lack of trust for lots of folks in government, and also lack of trust for lots of folks in corporate America, right? So I think it's happening on both ends potentially, and affecting kind of voters' decisions and how they're thinking about how they're doing right now with the present economy. But two other things that have come up in this conversation related to inflation too is sort of expectations, right? And what people can do based on how they understand the economy is going. And so, that behavior is going to be different for different types of voters and different kinds of demographics. And how much of expectation setting, how much we're spending based on what we think we need in the future versus what we need now is also going to affect inflation, right? So consumers are not benign in this, in what is happening right now, which I think is interesting, right? And in terms of voting. So this perception that this is all about the Biden administration, or it's all about government, or it's all about corporate America, how we buy and how we spend, how we interact with the economy also affects price setting behavior. So that's sort of one other element to add to this. And then the second is, voters, Mike, you and I have talked about this a little bit as we're preparing this conversation, tend to be short-sighted versus future-oriented, right? And so what happens even the next 6 weeks could affect what the election results are. And, I don't have a crystal ball to figure out that dilemma. But we know that the economy is not lockstep with elections. And how to correctly give attribution, right, to policy decisions that affect where we are today when we vote is another dilemma, probably magnified by the echo chambers and other things you're talking about in social media. So what would be a solution to that? We think about things like feedback effects a lot here at the Sanford School. I'm not a political scientist, but we think about information and education and kind of how that's being transmitted and digested.
I myself am skeptical about the possibility of a solution, in the sense that the last time this happened was in the 15th and 16th centuries with the invention of the printing press. Mm-hmm. And the beginning of the use of anonymous pamphlets basically destroyed all of people's sense of trust in existing institutions. And partly that went along with the Protestant Reformation, but there were wars for a long time. And so I think a lot of people that are throwing bombs saying that we would like to get rid of these institutions that we don't trust run the risk of, we could easily be in a setting where we don't have institutions that we trust, and it might take a long time to rebuild them. So the temptation to try to get power by destroying political institutions, I would hope, would be resisted. The problem is it's really effective. And since it works, it's very difficult not to, but I've become more and more interested in that analogy. It took almost a century to reestablish some sort of sense of legitimate authority. And we might be able to telescope that some, but the idea that there's a solution by pulling on a policy lever, economic revolutions don't care what we think about them. And the fact that they're going to have catastrophic results and there's this unsettling creative destruction effect means that we may be in for a couple of difficult decades.
Right. And so I think what you're proposing is sort of who has economic power and how to change, right, the vehicles of economic power and decision making. And I just want to add two more things before you comment on that, thinking about institutions and economic agents. It's been really striking. I'm just going to go back to children and families. It's just where I sit, my expertise. But it was really striking to me the role that schools took over the pandemic as kind of mechanisms of economic change. I mean, they were the schools, because they have such a big footprint in the US, were really how people got food over the pandemic. You know, they became the distribution centers for food benefits. And that is not their conventional role. And now that, you know, schools are being asked to do so much more in terms of services and support. And so how do we think about that? That's not their core mission. The core mission is to educate children after they get into the, you know, in their school doors. The second is community-based organizations, right? And thinking more ground up rather than top down, which is, we're sort of in a middle place now in the US, where we have lots of federal authority, but a lot of that in the last 20 years has been really devolved, right, to states and cities and counties. So those elections matter a lot now, because there's just basically more decision-making authority and more money, right? The budgets are much bigger and looser parameters to make those decisions. Now that can be good because it can be very tailored to populations that, you know, are being served and responsive to voters locally, but it also can be setting up an on-ramp for, you know, exploitation, abuse, and all those kinds of things, power differentials.
The difficulty for many states is that if the governor backed the desire of many public school teachers to be able to teach remotely, after many of the families that had to keep their children home started to feel economic stress because of that, because they couldn't go to work. That sort of drove a wedge between many people who otherwise would have supported public schools and started to look for alternatives. They looked for homeschooling, they looked for private schools that had reopened earlier. And so I worry that the result is a potential collapse, at least in some states, of the support for public schools, because you've lost another 5 or 10% of people that now are doing something else, and they're not going to send their kids back to public schools. So all of the advantages that you rightly say about this, it was at least an infrastructure for the delivery of benefits. Maybe it wasn't designed for that, but it was potentially there. Schools can no longer carry out that function. And so rebuilding the institution is going to have to reestablish that kind of trust. And I'm not trying to make a comment on the merits of should they have been open or not, but it was the opinion of many parents who really needed to go to work that the schools are not doing their job. And their job as daycare is probably unfair, but it is something we depend on the schools for.
Should we move to, I'm just looking at the time, should we move to Q&A, Joe and others, or would you like us to continue to debate?
Sure, let's go ahead and turn to our audience for some questions. I know that we had a couple, particularly in the discussion that you all were having around how the current administration is not necessarily responsible for the current state of the economy, and there's a bit of a lag there. So can you talk a little bit more about how that gets transpired, especially during a midterm elections process where we're trying to figure out how do we prepare for the next phase of our economy with the current people that we're trying to put into our system of government?
I can say a little bit. I saw one of the questions about the economy. One of the difficulties that we have in response to a large increase in world oil prices is that the price of oil in the US goes up, even though we're more or less energy self-sufficient. And the reason is it is possible for refineries or oil producers to sell it in other countries. And so the blame, whether it's right or not, I think is hard to say, but the blame that was put on the Biden administration was that they had restricted they had opposed new pipelines, and they had prevented the opening of fracking fields by either taxing or making it more difficult to have an application process. So the responsiveness of the U.S. oil industry is less than it would have been. That is, the U.S. could have increased the amount of oil that they were producing faster in order to drive this price down. There's something to that, but the magnitudes that we're talking about, it takes a year or two to bring a lot of these new oil fields back online. And in fact, oil prices now have at least stabilized. So to the extent that energy prices were the cause of the beginning of inflation, I think that's probably not really an accurate thing to blame the Biden administration for, though I am sympathetic to the claim that you can't have it both ways. So the Biden administration, on one hand, said, we're going to prevent these new sources. We're going to shut down nuclear power plants. We're going to make it more difficult to have these kinds of energy that we don't like. And then they sent out all the oil from the strategic oil reserve, which is supposed to be for times of war. And they clearly did it. That I would blame the Biden administration for. They did that just to try to buy votes because it's an election year. So the U.S. has depleted the strategic oil reserve to try to keep oil prices low just because it's an election year. Whereas, in fact, if you're an environmentalist, you should want high oil prices so people will buy more electric cars, they'll buy solar panels. We need high oil prices. But politically, it's just death to do that. And so I think that the Biden administration didn't do a very good job of explaining what was the rationale behind this policy. But the question that I saw, in my view, is a little bit too harsh in saying that it is the fault of the Biden administration. I think it's more complicated than that.
Well, as we're waiting for questions to come in from our audience, I was really interested in the point that you made, Mike, about how people are going back to work, but they're just not necessarily returning to jobs. And Lisa, the point that you made that kind of intertwines with that, which is that, in order for us to have a robust economy, we really do need opportunity for those in our workforce who have young families to be able to return to work and have something that they can rely on to make sure that their children are safe and well cared for at that time. So, how does that play a role right now as we move into this midterm election and thinking about continuing to revive the economy, since we're sort of in this weird space post-COVID, and seeing signs of a looming recession? Can you guys speak to that a little bit more deeply?
Yes and no. Some of this is going to be with Mike's expertise, right? Because I think intertwining your question is, and that we can't forget, like, who's voting, is intertwined with what we should care about, right? And I can't speak so much to who's going to land, at the voting booths in the next election, like Mike can. But I can say I also really appreciate this distinction between work and jobs. And it's a little bit of, we can't have both, right? We can't have a country that is going to really honor and try to reward the value of work, right? This is a very strong ethic in our country, and it's a good one. And almost everyone values having a job and bringing income home from earnings, right? It's a misperception that some people just don't want that and are going to be lazy and what have you. There'll always be those folks, but that is not the prevailing kind of narrative or reality. But we can't have that and also no kind of social insurance to protect folks from all the situations we just talked about, right? Who have not had the opportunity to have a lot of savings and cushions, who don't have access to things like, health insurance has changed, but don't have kind of access to other forms of public goods and services that are protected in downtimes, or who can't dip into some kind of government support during things like recessions, during dips in the economy, during things like the pandemic, that will, one little shift, right? If you don't have a lot of resources, can really be a spiral into poverty. And that's much, much harder to get out of, right? So I guess I tend to think of this like, how do we protect all folks from getting into that downward spiral? Because that's a bigger problem in the next few years that does have feedback effects into our economy. And so, whether it's jobs or work, I think thinking holistically about how that's enough income for people to do what they need to do and take care of themselves and their families is the way to think about this. And it's very clear that the labor market is not solving this dilemma. Right? And so there's lots of ways to think about responses. They can be things like increasing living wages that has its own sort of set of trade-offs and debates. It can be things like offering cash directly to families as basic income or individuals as basic income, and that has lots of trade-offs. And so we can go down different kinds of policy conversations related to that.
The idea of a living wage, the idea of increasing minimum wages as a response to this, I think is understandable, but unfortunate, because what we're seeing is, and there have been a number of studies at the University of Washington, actually by some people who used to be at the Sanford Institute, because of the high minimum wage in Seattle. And the result has been that the total number of hours worked is basically the same, but they've hired more workers to hire fewer work hours each. So it used to be you had a 40-hour-a-week job and benefits. Now, in response to this, you're hiring people for 28 hours so that you don't have to pay benefits, or you're paying 19 so that you don't have to, there are other restrictions. And so the result is these aren't exactly gigs, but they're not exactly jobs either. Mark Andreessen in 2011 had a famous piece in the Wall Street Journal where he said software eats the world, and software can replace service workers. So if you remember nothing else about what I said today, it should be this: software is to service jobs as robots and automation are to manufacturing jobs.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
So if I go into a McDonald's, they've turned the cash register around. There's no longer a person who hears my words and puts it in. I do it on a kiosk. All those people lost their jobs. And this will be accelerated by minimum wages, because the economic logic of using software to replace service workers will be increased. So that's at best a cynical short-term political solution, because a lot of people will vote for it. But I'm afraid that's really going to harm a lot of the people it's supposed to help. And so I do worry about that.
Yeah, I agree. And so one way to think about this, I mean, you can imagine that there's vast R&D investments happening now to think about how to automate more in the future, given the last 5 years. And so automation, robotics, we're going to see more of this in our economy, and those are going to be replacing jobs. So one is to think about how to redirect, right, folks who might be skilled to do those jobs into other types of jobs. The other is, again, to think about, well, what are the other avenues of economic support so we prevent spirals and bigger problems in the future, which are very costly. And then I think the third is, how do we also think about the jobs that can't be robots, right? So this is going back to like kind of the care economy, the teaching economy, the medical field. I'd be hard pressed to think that our nurses are going to become robots, right? So there are going to be some growing sectors as well that are still kind of service oriented. And so how do we make sure that those are jobs that are stable? Those are jobs, not just work. To use Mike's way of conceptualizing this.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike. Sorry, one more point, and then we've got another question in our chat for you guys.
There were a couple of questions about spending, and so I was going to go to those.
Okay, great. That sounds wonderful.
So the Democrats had a remarkably ham-handed response to this. They actually had a mission accomplished party and declared that inflation was over. And they passed a bill which they called the Inflation Control Act, which involved hiring a whole lot of people in a labor market that we knew was already overstretched to provide these jobs that people were hiring. So it was hard to get people to come back to work. You have to pay much higher wages. And so the infrastructure bill and now the other spending bills, including the defense industry that's trying to ramp up the weapons that we're trying to send to Ukraine. All of those things, there's no question, those are increasing inflation. And then for the Democrats to have a big party and have pictures of them with balloons saying that we have whipped inflation was a terrible idea. It really rang false. And so I think it made people feel that either that the Democrats were out of touch or were just cynically trying to pretend they were whistling past the graveyard, and no one was fooled by it. So it does seem to me that we can't blame the president for causing the inflation. On the other hand, the fact that we are not doing the things that we could do to try to talk inflation down, and instead are saying we're going to increase spending on every margin in ways that are not targeted on poor people. on ways that are actually targeted on longer run things like infrastructure or the defense industry, that means that you're losing all of your credibility on inflation and you're not getting anything to families. So it's a wonkish kind of approach, but politically it's disastrous.
Right. Well, it's wonkish in that it has a short term, right? It has some short term immediate effect. And so lots of flash and maybe moving people to polls. But, those dollars are coming from somewhere. It's debt, it's deficit spending. That's going to have impacts again on future generations.
We had a question, and Mike, you touched on this a little bit about what the effect of the money that we've been spending to defend Ukraine is having on the inflation right now.
I think it takes the effect of displacing, and Lisa just said this, really, it comes from somewhere. So the emphasis comes on from somewhere else, the attention, instead of schools, we're doing this, and the money, we're hiring people to do that instead of let's rebuild schools in Florida, let's worry about building the things that are needed for middle class people. And it may make perfect strategic sense. I'm not opposed to helping Ukraine, but as a policy that the Democrats claimed was supposed to solve the problem of inflation, it just doesn't add up. I saw one of the comments on the chat say, huh? Yes, huh? It doesn't pass the laugh test, except nobody's laughing.
Yeah. I see someone saying, Milton Friedman, please come home. Very interesting. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Joe. Did you want?
Yeah, we had a question earlier about books, but maybe in general, most of us are not economists, and a lot of these talking points can often go over many of our heads, whether we're trying to stay up on it by watching news or debates or read, current periodicals. But what are some things that you guys could suggest to our audience to help them better understand these issues from a layperson's perspective, whether those are books or articles or, other places where you get your information?
So I would like to promote something called econofact.org. I don't know if, Mike, you know about Econofact. It's hosted by the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And the entire mission is to translate these thorny economic questions into really precise memos and podcasts out for audiences. So I've written for them on some issues, obviously focus on children and families, but it's very broad. So I will put that into the chat. Mike, do you have a recommendation?
I have a book that came out in 2021 that was published by the Institute for Economic Affairs on the sharing economy and its effect on labor markets. And the price is right. It's available for free as a PDF. So I even on volume, I can't make up the difference. But so the title of the book is The Sharing Economy, and it's from the Institute for Economic Affairs. You can just download the PDF from there. I would also recommend looking at the podcast called Econ Talk, which a guy named Russ Roberts, he's the president of Shalem College, but he also, they try to give ideas about simplifying complicated economic policies. And if you look through the subjects, there have been a lot on labor markets and the problem of families and labor markets. I can't think of the woman's name, the female economist that has written about families, Emily. Well, there's a number of podcasts about the economics of families there that I thought cross-cut ideological disputes in a way that's actually confusing, because you end up thinking, I'm not sure if this is from the left or right, but those tend to be the ones that I find the most useful, because if you just take an ideologically pure perspective on this, it's not, you have a hard time updating in a period when the problems that we face are new.
Definitely. Thank you guys for sharing those. And we're getting on towards, now we're getting our questions in. Awesome. So let's see here. Bill is asking about, instead of each political party always taking, the negative shot at each other, would the discussion be more rational with Final Five voting? Is there hope for states to move more in that kind of direction? And Bill, we actually had an entire segment about our discussing our right to vote, and we want to really focus in this discussion on talking about our economy. But maybe to the vein of voting, adjust the question a little bit. What do people need to be looking at in their candidates when they think about who the candidate is for them as it relates to what's happening in our economy?
Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, since I am myself a third-party candidate for North Carolina Senate right now, I would be interested in the idea of institutional change. So ranked choice voting, or some of the ideas about making it possible for outsiders outside of the two state-sponsored parties, at least to raise some of these questions, I think is pretty important. The difficulty is that as it stands, our political system makes it very difficult for people to talk about a positive, optimistic vision of the future, that these are the things, if you vote for me, that I will do for you. It works much better if you say my opponent kills and eats babies. Even if you're not sure if it's true, they'll say, oh, that was kind of interesting. I'm going to look more about what a bad person that is. So there's an asymmetry in the way people assess information about threats. And it's very difficult as a political candidate or political consultant not to take advantage of that if you're in a close race. And right now, all the races are close. So I don't know what to look for in a candidate. What I hope is that if we have a change in the electoral system itself, which of course is a quixotic thing, because that means the existing parties would have to vote for it. But still, if we were to have a way of opening this up, then it is possible that there would be pressure from other kinds of candidates.
So I'm going to follow that up by saying that, the way that political campaigns work right now are very smart. We know that pulling on people's heartstrings works, and we know that ideology really works. And we know that not always telling the facts works. And so if you were to ask me if I could change one thing, is really paying attention to, are there real solutions being proposed for, to help the economy in a real way? And that's been a shift, I think. We hear less about like concrete economic solutions, not pie in the sky, like I'm going to, reduce debt for everybody. That's great. How are you going to do that? How is it going to be implemented? Who's going to be affected? What are the trade-offs? This is very much economic thinking in the way that Mike and I think, and this isn't a call that everyone should, be understanding economics, but are real policy solutions being proposed that will actually have traction with the, American population and the voting population is the thing that I would want more attention paid to.
What do you feel like is happening here at Duke to dive into these areas of research, maybe dispel some of the false information that takes place? I know you guys listed some resources that you turn to, but what's happening here at our own institution that you can point to for our audience?
This is much more Lisa.
Yeah, so the Duke Sanford School of Public Policy, I think, is pretty unique in this space, right? So we have a whole communications and media and journalism center called the DeWitt Center in our school, and we have a whole cadre of experts thinking about things like the policy feedback effects. How do we filter real information from echo chambers? So I would suggest kind of poking around at the DeWitt Center. We have some very active faculty that are speaking to these issues about misinformation. And they're teaching lots of students. And so there's a lot of activity here along those lines.
Awesome.
And then there's some of us who teach economics that, that can also help there.
We do that. Is there anything else that you all would like to leave our audience with, a final thought or something that you hope they'll take away from today's session?
I guess a note of optimism from me. I think everybody, when they look at the sort of intellectual quality and the anger of elections, it's easy to get down. Elections are always like this. The US system is strong enough to withstand this. What it requires is some forbearance on the part of all of us to try to talk to people we disagree with rather than demonize them. So having that movement go forth from this time and place, if everybody can make an effort to do that, I don't think that things are so bad, and this may make the parties stronger in the sense that we will focus more on elections that are more substantive if voters demand it.
I agree with that. I'm going to put another note of optimism, which is I have a lot of faith in the next generation, right? So the younger generation who are growing up in this atmosphere. I think they are the right angry and the right frustration. At least that's what I'm seeing on campuses. And I think they're the real engines of change along all the lines that we talked about, and understanding the economy and being, having the right concerns about their future. And, they are the future voters. They're also very engaged in trying to get more people to vote and be civically engaged.
Gosh, thank you both so much for your time today, giving us a little bit more insight into our midterm elections and specific issues related to what's happening with our economy.